Jackson's King Kong is probably one of the better of the licensed games over the years, not that that's saying much. It's no golden child, but the mix of tense first-person shooting with Jack and the over-the-top action of King Kong blended fairly well. Sadly though, the DS version is extremely lacking, as you can see in the card at the beginning of this video. The GBA version seems nice in its own right, but that's more Legend of Zelda than console King Kong. Is there an actual honest-to-God proper representation of this game on handheld systems? That's what I hope to answer right now as I review Peter Jackson's King Kong, the official game of the movie for the Sony PlayStation Portable.
Gotta reload. That's okay. I got enough magazines.
Right off the bat, the game is very familiar to those who've seen the home releases. Granted in an FMV rather than real time. It's made apparent when, rather than serving as a tutorial for the camera controls, Jack just looks up on his own accord. The game starts proper and Jack's completely alone. I guess the others moved on while he was unconscious. Talk about some messed up friends, huh? In any case, the game mostly plays how you would expect. You grab some kind of gun and either some kind of spear or some kind of bone to defend yourself with. Well, you can never truly run out of a means to defend yourself, since bones seem to infinitely respawn from sources. It's still pretty tense as Jack. You'll relish any chance you can get to grab a shotgun or some other firearm, since you only get one thrown weapon before you're stuck looking for another one. Thankfully, most enemies in the game can be felled with one thrown weapon. The obvious exception is the raptors, which tend to have hiding spots to utilize. Obviously, the giant crab is another exception, serving as more of a one-off boss than a reoccurring enemy. Regular crabs can potentially take two, but if you wait until they lift up to attack, their underbelly is exposed and it just takes one. It makes for some nice strategy to save on resources. Another plus is that you can set bones and spears on fire to do extra damage. You can also potentially use flaming weapons to get rid of shrubbery, which serves as one of the game's puzzle types. Well, what you call puzzles, it's more like fetch quests to stretch the game out. At least the game will use waterfalls that threaten to douse this precious flame to serve as a bit of an obstacle. That and fetching levers will serve as the crux of the game, with them being combined at points with the lever behind shrubbery. By contrast, playing as Kong is pretty much smashing, swinging, and climbing. If you aren't swinging and climbing, you're likely smashing down a T-Rex. T-Rexes are actually pretty easy in this version if you can get away from them somewhere and just pound on Kong's chest. Doing this puts him into a sort of temporary super mode where he just wrecks T-Rexes and puts them into the jawbreaker super easily. That's exactly the strategy I opted to use because I'm not very good with the whole fighting game operation. Plus, it's exciting to be as overpowered as Kong is in the canon. That's especially true when he's rampaging through New York. You even get to swat away airplanes, unlike the DS version's cutscene-only approach, and I'd like to see how long I can last by using the building itself as cover. Even if the inevitable is coming, it feels like it's making a difference somehow, which adds to the fun. Sadly, in addition to missing companions outright, the game is missing a ton of levels. You might say it's an attempt to be a compilation of the home version's greatest hits. At least it has some major ones like the River T-Rex chase that was even in the DS version. It's not hard to imagine why, given how thrilling it is to have to fend off a T-Rex as tiny little Jag, giving it new meaning after you've been smacking them around as Kong. When you're a frail little human, they suddenly become far more menacing. Then there's stuff like the giant enemy crab and navigating on thin wooden bridges that look like they could break apart any minute. Not the biggest fan of the water wading section since you go so slowly, but at least it's faithful to the home releases, so there's that. All around, the gameplay serves just fine. While the PSP version is very limited in scope and acts as the companions entirely, at least it feels like the home release mostly. Between this and the DS version having companions but otherwise feeling like a hollow shell, I'll take the companionless PSP version. If anything, it makes the Jack section feel even more like a survival horror type of experience, and being King Kong is a lot more satisfying and less frustrating than the DS version. It's only a shame the lack of companions make the slower parts of the game all the more noticeable, even if there's a lot less content overall. The plot is more or less completely intact. The lack of companion characters means that the little interactions are almost completely gone, but the concept is the same. Carl wants to reinvigorate his career with a trip to the infamous Skull Island with Anne as his leading lady. It becomes immediately apparent that this was a bad idea, as the island is swarming with hostile tribesmen and man-eating monsters virtually everywhere. Guess it's fortunate for them that King Kong isn't such a bad guy, and after Anne is handed over to him, not only does he not harm her, he takes a liking to her. I would say spoiler warning, but there really isn't that much to spoil in the PSP game. Still, here's your chance to go into presentation via the timestamps. Throughout the course of the game, Jack and the others are trying to survive while Kong is fending off creatures to protect Anne. Well, I say Jack and the others, but because of the nature of this game, it's pretty much just Jack by himself until they finally capture King Kong. Their paths eventually cross with King Kong, and as I mentioned, some knockout gas is used to capture him. Angered by the guests ignoring the sign that clearly says no flash photography and probably the mediocre champagne offered for the event, Kong goes on a rampage. Grabbing Anne, he climbs the biggest building in the city for his last stand. Being felled by the airplanes, 'twas beauty killed the beast and all that good stuff, and it's over. Not gonna lie, it's a real shame that the PSP's limitations mean that the companion characters get so many less opportunities to interact, and this is probably where it got hit the hardest. If this is your only experience with the game, you might think there's no real reason for the characters to even like each other. They barely interact or even see each other at all, and Jack only seems to care about saving Anne out of obligation. Still, what's there is there. Even if it's mostly just Jack doing his own thing, the plot is intact enough to get the gist of what's going on, and it still tells a nice Beauty and the Beast kind of story. Like the DS version, it starts out properly with a starting area. However, unlike the DS version, it doesn't quickly devolve into a hot mess afterwards. Every area you see in the game is well representative of the console version, at least every area they bothered to include in this version. The highlight of the game is easily the section where you're storming through New York, something the DS relegated to a cutscene, but the game as a whole shines on the system. Perhaps the one blemish graphically is that there are sections where there's tearing along polygonal edges. It was also noticeable in the DS version, oddly enough, but it's nothing too severe. Perhaps the one spot in the game that most showcases the PSP's limitations, though, is the Brontosaurus scene. Not when you're walking through them, that was cut in this version, but they're to the side and you make your way above them. Likely due to the PSP's limited 222 MHz processor, this crowd of Brontosaurus has sadly been diminished to strays wandering in the same direction. They still look quite good for the system, but it's a shame they're so sparse. The same processor limitation is likely why companions are completely cut, arguably the one aspect the DS does any better in. It's very much an isolated experience with the only evidence of Jack's friends being in cutscenes. Speaking of cutscenes, the game relies heavily on FMVs to move the plot forward. They're mostly the same, but hilariously Jack actually frees himself after King Kong takes Anne to explain why Carl isn't around. Shame he couldn't magically free himself a bit sooner, huh? One nice thing, though, is that you can still set shrubbery on fire. While it's only in select areas, you can't get too crazy with it. It still looks pretty cool watching the fire spread around for a bit. The fire on a spear or bone likewise looks pretty cool to wave around. The enemies are mostly present and accounted for and look exactly as you would expect. From the crabs, including its giant variant, to the raptors, to the giant mutant bats. Even centipedes are present, something that wasn't in the DS game. I guess they couldn't properly represent it wrapping around things in that version. Naturally, the T-Rex river scene that was even in the DS version is included, and it's every bit as tense as you would expect. Unlike the DS version, however, this also includes you swatting planes away as Kong in the end. While the extremely low-res state of the distant city is all too obvious in 1080p, it still makes for a nice backdrop. One thing I'll note, though, is that Jack's hands look a little weird for the first-person models. However, they look weird even on the PC and Xbox 360 versions, so I'll give it a pass. The third-person moments as King Kong are likewise as satisfying as ever, especially breaking a T-Rex's jaw open. It's charmingly amusing seeing major threats like raptors and bats as Jack just fall before your feet as Kong with how comparatively smaller they are. The music throughout the game is every bit as cinematic as in the main console games. That's something that likewise hasn't changed throughout most of the versions, DS included. While there's much less voice acting than the home versions due to the lack of companions quipping through the levels, what's there is still very well done. Jack Black as Carl is hilarious when he gets the chance to talk, and the main character Jack still talks to himself about how many rounds he has left on backup. Sound effects are fine for what they are. The dinosaur sounds pack a punch, and Kong giving off a victory roar after felling a T-Rex really gives some weight to how powerful he is. All around, the presentation is very well handled for the little handheld. It's obviously very compromised compared to the home console versions, including the PS2 version, but at least it nails the overall look. Unlike the DS version, they didn't just give up halfway through. The locations are very faithfully represented. What's actually there anyway? The best way to describe it is it's the home versions of King Kong with a lot of corners cut and a fair amount of compromise. You might say it's like an isolated version of the main game's greatest hits. It still manages to look and especially sound quite good, and the shortcomings are mostly a lot harder to notice on the PSP's native resolution. The PSP version of this game is in a weird position overall. On one hand, it's lacking the companions and a lot of content from the console versions. On the other hand, it nearly perfectly replicates the mechanics of its home counterparts in a way the DS couldn't even begin to match. The best way you could describe it is it's the same game but put through a sander. What I mean is I would still consider it very solid overall, easily the best way to play it on a handheld system outside of phone emulators, but it still falls short of the console versions. Still, if you absolutely must play it on the go without either emulation or some kind of pocket PC, it's at least a vastly better option than that DS afterthought. This has been my review of Peter Jackson's King Kong, the official game of the movie for the PlayStation Portable. That is a mouthful, isn't it? I've got live streams Thursday and Monday at 4:30 p.m., news video next Friday at 6 p.m., and Let's Plays at 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. daily. All Eastern Standard Time, but subscribe and power primate punch that bell icon if you want to keep notified. A like and comment are always appreciated, but I just hope you genuinely enjoyed it, and that is it for now. Thank you so much for tuning in with me. This week's epic freebie until next Thursday is the BioShock Collection, containing 1, 2, and Infinite and all that extra stuff in between. Capitalize on life, peace out, have a good one, and have a nice and pleasant day.
Block his way!